All right, so welcome everybody. Again, I'm Dr. Amanda Dye. I'm the Director of Advising and Programs at Beyond Barnard. And today we're here to talk about interviewing. So I'm going to share my screen with you all and we'll go through this presentation. So I think of interviewing as a really exciting opportunity in the job and internship search process. It's often a part of professional school application processes, and that's why I like to talk about it here in Career Skills Week. So my day job, as far as advising is concerned, is I work with pre-health students. So I do advising for folks who are interested in clinical careers in medicine, psychology, nursing, dentistry, you name it. And interviewing is a big part of a lot of those application processes as well. So I'm excited to share with you a little bit of my thoughts about kind of how interviewing can benefit you in your application processes. So we have a pretty simple agenda. We'll talk a little bit about how to kind of get into the right mind frame for an interview, which is really important for presenting yourself in the best possible way. We'll talk about how to prepare for both in-person and virtual interviews. We'll walk through some of the very common kinds of questions that show up in lots of different interview settings and think a little bit about how to read those questions so that you can respond to them in the best way possible. And then at the end, we'll talk just a little bit about following up after interviews. So interviews are really, I like to think of them as a two-way street. They're a really important part of the process because on the employer or the graduate school side, they want to know, are you the right fit for this position? Can you do whatever this position is? But at the same time, you actually are coming to an interview to learn as well. You want to know if you can do the job that you are applying for, whether you want to do that job. You know, meeting the people that you're going to work with is a really important aspect of interviewing. You want to know if it's a good fit for you overall. And so going into an interview with the mindset, not just that you are there to be judged, but that you are also there to do some evaluating, that's a really important thing. So the interview is an opportunity to articulate your thoughts about why you're a good fit for the role that's being hired. It's an opportunity for you to really share some of the key skills and experiences that you have that make you a good match. But at the same time, you're getting to know these people better. You're getting to know the organization better so that you can think about that fit piece. And I always ask students to remember, if you're invited to interview, that means they already like your application. Most companies, most grad programs, whatever it is, people only interview a small subset typically of the folks who apply for any given position. And so go into it with confidence, knowing that, yes, these people already think that you are a good candidate, which is important. You want to make them like you for this particular position and be very confident that you can do that job. So on the day of the interview, it's important to take time to focus. Do the things that help you focus, maybe before exams or before other big things in life. The things that help you manage stress are things that you should always do on an interview day. So if you're a person who likes to exercise first thing in the morning, make sure you do that. If you are really regimented about what you eat that energizes you, have something that you like, have a favorite food or, your favorite coffee before you go into the interview. Maybe talk to somebody in your life who's really good at kind of giving you inspiration and giving pep talks, somebody who's going to put you in a positive frame of mind. And then having that routine, kind of figuring out which pieces of that, you can repeat as you have interviews in the future, that really can help you sort of train for a period where you're doing lots of interviews. And so if that's maybe, say you apply for positions over the summer and you've kind of got to do a lot of interviews all in a short space of time, or maybe you're coming up on graduation and you're interviewing for a lot of full-time jobs, it's really helpful to just kind of get into a rhythm with interviewing, because ultimately practicing interviewing makes you feel more confident when you go into those settings and helps you really manage those nerves a lot better. So with that said, I want to talk about interview preparation. I think this section and the next one are the most important pieces of today's presentation. So we want to talk about how do you actually prepare so that you go into an interview feeling confident about it. So the first thing really, really important is to do your research. Research the company, research the industry, the position in particular. Take a look at anything you can find online. If the company has a web presence, if they have social media, you can Google companies to sort of see if they're showing up in the news in particular ways. Also, if you're applying for a lot of positions in a particular industry, following the news generally about that industry is really helpful so that you're aware of any kind of trends or things that people in that industry might be concerned about. These are all really, really important for kind of helping you stay relaxed in the interview setting. And you don't even need to wait for the interview to do this first piece. As you're finding job descriptions that you're kind of interested in applying to, you can be doing these things at the same time so that you're evaluating the company, you're figuring out, yeah, like I do think I want to submit this application. I am interested in exploring this particular field. So you can actually start with this piece of the research pretty early on. If you are given information about the interviewers, it's pretty common to try to learn a little bit about them. It's very often when I interview people, they have usually Googled me before, which is like a little frightening, but expected because people want to know who they're talking to in these settings. So, if you know the folks that are going to be interviewing you, if one of them might be the direct supervisor for the position, that's really important. You can Google them, you can check out their LinkedIn just to see a little bit more about what they do, their role, their place within the organization. That can be really helpful because people are often likely to ask questions that really kind of respond to their role within the organization. So if you are interviewing with somebody who's going to be your direct supervisor, they might have more questions about the way that you work, the kinds of preferences that you have about supervision, or the kinds of teams that you like to work on, because they want to kind of get a sense of, are you a good fit for, their team? And if you're interviewing with somebody who maybe interacts with the position in a more tangential way, then they could have a very different set of questions. So thinking about those questions, thinking about what to anticipate, always review the job description. When you apply for a job, keep a copy of the description somewhere. Sometimes they get taken down from HR websites, so save them yourself because you want to use that as a guide for your prep. The things that come up as key responsibilities for that position are things that are very likely to be asked about in an interview. So in your preparation, once you've reviewed that job description and kind of assessed what those particular pieces of information are, then you'll think about the relevant skills and qualities that you bring to the job. So thinking about the things that you are sure you want people to know about you in relationship to this particular position by the end of an interview, that helps you kind of create your keywords, the things that you want people to know. So once you have identified those relevant skills and qualities, start to think about your background, the things that you've presented on your resume, and try to choose some examples, some particular stories, some particular anecdotes that will help you to demonstrate each of those qualities. So, if the job requires extensive knowledge of social media, you want to think about your experience there and particular anecdotes that you can show or that you can tell to demonstrate your facility with that kind of task. It's great if you can keep in mind really flexible examples, stories that can be used to prep for a lot of different kinds of questions. So stories that have different elements, maybe not just your social media expertise, but say your expertise in interpersonal communications, if you were working on a team with another person on a social media initiative. And of course, if it's on your resume, do be prepared to talk about it. You never know, you might have an organization on your resume that somebody else worked for a long time ago, or you might have gone to the same school as one of the interviewers, or you might share some interest with one of the interviewers. And so things that could come up really do depend on what catches the eye of the folks who are doing the interviewing. Before you interview, I think it's a great idea to practice out loud. Particularly if you're going to do a video interview. It can be both deeply uncomfortable, but also very instructive to record yourself answering questions and play it back to review. That way, you're going to be comfortable with how you're presenting. You're going to know what the person on the other side of the video screen sees when you are answering. And that's an important thing for you to be aware of, as horrible as it is to watch yourself talk. I will not be watching the recording of this event myself. So that's one thing to do. Also, you can also come to Beyond Barnard. We do interview prep. You can work with a PCA pretty much anytime on prep for any kind of interview. You can also schedule an appointment with a professional advisor to do a mock interview and kind of talk through questions about preparing for a specific industry or specific company's interview. Interview dress is important. I think you will probably find that different interviewers attach different levels of importance to attire. I think that it is always better to be a little bit too dressed up versus too informal. Doing a little bit too much as far as formality is at least demonstrating that you are taking this seriously. And I think that's really part of the key here for attire. Dressing professionally can mean different things for different industries. So it's a good idea to kind of consider what professional dress is for the particular industry that you are entering. Some are much more formal than others. And it's also okay to show personality. It does not have to be a black or gray suit, but I would say don't have a lot of distractions. Super noisy jewelry, lots of bangles or things like that can be a little bit tricky in an interview situation. So make sure that, you're representing yourself authentically, but in a way that allows your candidacy to shine through. And of course, if you are doing a virtual interview, same outfit as you would for an in-person interview. Even if you're only, kind of showing the shoulders, you want the person on the other side of the camera to think, yes, this person is as prepared as possible. This person is professional and, is kind of taking this opportunity seriously, even though it's not in person. If you're interviewing in person, I think it's always a good idea to be prepared. Bring a copy of your resume for every person you'll be interviewing, have a couple of extras. You may very well not need them. In the modern day with electronic applications, almost always your interviewers will have printed out a copy of your resume and cover letter before the interview, so they'll have those documents, but just in case, you want to definitely be prepared. If you're going somewhere in person, leave early, make sure you know the route. Everybody who's spent some time in New York City knows that the MTA is not the most reliable transit system in the world. So give yourself a little bit of extra time to get to where you're going. If you're interviewing virtually, make sure your software is all updated. Do an audio and video check, the day before, just to make sure everything is working. Check your internet speed wherever you are kind of having the interview to make sure that you're going to be okay. And find somewhere that is as quiet as possible, somewhere with a neutral background. Try to have, lighting that is in front of you so your face can be seen. You can use headphones with built-in microphones to help with volume and clarity. Sometimes built-in mics on laptops and things like that aren't always as sensitive as they could be. And if you are kind of working with, a typical laptop microphone, just make sure to speak at a relatively, I say slowly here, but I think a moderate pace, and enunciate well. So make sure that you are kind of maintaining volume and speaking as clearly as you can. And then finally, right before the interview, double check the tech that you're using. If you are using a device that you share with other people, especially younger siblings or people who like to use a lot of filters, just make sure that you check in right before the interview and are sure that everything is the way that you want it to be. In terms of kind of using notes during virtual interviews, I think sometimes there's a temptation, because nobody can see what's on the desk in front of you, to maybe have a lot of notes. I think that it's good to resist that urge, because you don't want to appear to be reading from a prepared script during an interview. I think it's fine to have a couple of Post-its at the top of the computer with maybe some of those key things that you want the interviewer to know about you, some keywords to help you remember those anecdotes that you're going to use to illustrate particular points. Maybe have a copy of your resume and cover letter nearby just in case. But a lot more than that can be more distracting than it is helpful. Also, make sure you have your phone on silent but close by. If there's any kind of tech issue, maybe the internet drops during the interview, heaven forbid, you can at least let the interviewers know what's going on. So keeping the phone and separate contact info for the interviewers is very helpful. When you're speaking in a virtual interview, try to look at the camera or as near the camera as you can, not the person that you're talking to. You want to mimic the typical eye contact that you would have in an in-person event as best you can. Try to smile and make sure that you are having as positive a body language as you can. The level of eye contact that you use and the posture that you have during the interview can signal confidence, can signal openness, and that's a thing that's hard to convey in a virtual setting in particular. So you want to kind of amplify all of those cues the best that you can. When you're being asked a question, it's totally okay to look at the speaker while they're talking. That's actually helpful just to kind of sort of pick up on the nonverbal cues that they're sending out. And by that same token, nodding, appearing engaged in what the other person is saying is important. You want to make it as much like an in-person conversation as possible. Okay, so with preparation in mind, I want to talk with you all about common kinds of interview questions and ways that you can break down those questions to understand them in a way that helps you respond to them. So the first question that we'll talk about is the dreaded "tell me about yourself." Now, tell me about yourself is dreaded, I think, by a lot of people because it is so open form. It's so open-ended. It's very difficult to kind of at first glance think like, how much, how long do we have? How long am I supposed to talk about myself? And so, I think it is important to read this question as asking you, can you walk me through the highlights of this resume? Tell me about yourself in the context of this particular job. So you want to think about your background as a narrative leading to this position. You want to think about, again, those 2 or 3 key things that you want people to know. Those are things that you can hit in the "tell me about yourself" question. So talking about accomplishments and relevant experiences, try to balance that detail. So, not too vague, but not in minute detail. And don't assume that the person already knows your resume in detail. Maybe, not if there's more than one person in the room, it's possible that some people have glanced at it but maybe not reviewed the resume quite as carefully. So it's fine to kind of come back to things that are there on that resume. Why do you want to work here? Which comes in a lot of different questions. Why are you interested in working at Barnard is often a question that I ask when I hire people. And that's a question that you can read as, hey, what do you know about this organization? Here's the place where some of that prep that we talked about earlier really comes into play. So you can help the employer understand that the organization, you understand kind of its mission and values, where it is within the industry, what you understand about the particular position that you're applying for relative to the entire organization. And you can do the work of aligning your specific skills and experience to this particular opportunity. So again, you're not just talking about the company, not just talking about the organization, but you're talking about yourself in that context. What are your biggest strengths is often one that's really tricky for people to answer. I think, again, it's kind of an open-ended question. A lot of people have a lot of different kinds of strengths, and sometimes, those strengths are not necessarily as applicable to one, any given interview setting. So here, I think it's really important to, again, go back to using the job description as your guide. Think about what this particular role is asking of the candidate. And think about the things that you are good at that are related to that role. You can mix on the job skills and personal qualities. You could talk about things like organizational skills, but you could also talk about interpersonal skills as they relate to a position, particularly if there's an interpersonal component to that. And it is important not just to list these strengths, but also to give examples, to be able to illustrate. When I say that I have strong interpersonal skills and want to be able to give a short anecdote to illustrate that, yes, that is actually a thing that I've done. I think, again, really trying to think about what the strengths that you choose will say to the employer is a really good guide here. So similarly, what is your biggest weakness is, one of the questions that I don't think anybody really loves answering, but when you break it down a little bit, it's not that tricky. What is your biggest weakness is not necessarily a question that's asking you to be kind of vulnerably self-critical in an interview setting. It's a question that's asking you about your level of self-awareness and your ability to respond to feedback. That is important for pretty much any kind of work or graduate school setting. So I always encourage people to kind of change the language from weakness to challenge, internally, mentally, and try to use the past tense in creating your responses. So you can, kind of talk about things that have happened in the past and talk a little bit about the specific solutions that you've implemented to address that thing that's a challenge for you in the past. It doesn't have to be something that you've completely resolved. It could be something that you acknowledge you're still working on. But the important thing is that that's something that you want to work on, because every employer is looking for people who are aware of both their strengths and challenges and how to best build on both of them. I always encourage people, don't choose something here that would be a gigantic red flag. That I wouldn't say like my challenge is that I've never stuck with a job for more than a month. Like that's maybe not something for the interview setting, but it's something that's relevant to the position, right? So the example here about a leadership position and kind of it being a challenge to delegate tasks to others, that could certainly be something that you talk about if that's relevant to the job. I also encourage people not to say that, their biggest weakness is that they're a perfectionist. I don't think that says a lot about a person that is actually that positive. That doesn't give a sense of self-awareness, really. It doesn't give a sense that you're working on something, I think, the things that we call perfectionism, like I have a tendency to really focus on details when sometimes like things just need to get done. That is a little bit more of a self-aware way of presenting it. So I think really, kind of considering the way that you talk about these things is important. And then there's a big class of questions that are here kind of described as tell me about a time questions. These are often, kind of in the interviewing literature, they're known as behavioral questions. And essentially they're asking about your approach to a particular kind of situation. These are questions that are going to ask you to draw on experiences from the past so that the employer or whoever is interviewing you can understand how you might behave in similar situations in the future. So very typically, these kinds of questions are going to tie into the job. So let's say, it's a job where there is a component of needing to be kind of in charge of a particular program. Maybe you're hiring someone to be a point person for a particular program, and that you want somebody who is really creative, who's going to be able to kind of think in innovative ways about how to implement this program. You might ask as an interviewer, tell me about a time when you implemented a creative solution to a problem at work, and something like that. You could talk about it in any context, maybe not necessarily the same kind of work that you're applying for in this context, but it could still be, the kind of mechanics, the response itself is the important thing here. So usually these kinds of questions are related to a challenge or a success story. Common scenarios are, a time that you took initiative to solve a problem, a time that you improved a process, a time that you had to work with somebody who was a little bit difficult, and how you kind of manage that. Sometimes people will ask you to tell about a time that you failed. And these are all questions I think that that can be really successfully managed if you use a structure in the way that you think about them. So answering these kinds of questions with a specific structure can help you to stay relaxed and help you to present all of the information that you need in a way that's digestible to the person. So what do I mean by structure? So they're very similar models, SOAR and STAR. You start with kind of introducing the situation. In my position at company X, then you describe whatever the obstacle or the task is. So, I had to work with a particular client who was a really difficult person for whatever reasons. Then you talk about the actions that you took. What did you do in response to either the obstacle or the task that you'd been assigned to? And then what happened as a result of your actions? How did you resolve the conflict? How did you kind of manage the particular task? And if you think about it in that way, it'll help you to kind of go through the response in a way that helps you keep track of kind of where you are in the response, where you are in telling that story, and keep everything on target as far as relevance to the situation. And then, of course, it's very, very common. I hope that, typical in your interview settings, that the interviewer asks if you have a question for them. So it is always, always important to have a couple of questions going in. As you're doing your research, note down questions that you have, things that are specific to that position, maybe things that are specific to the organization. It could be, questions that ask the interviewer to elaborate or clarify something that you read on the company website. You could also certainly ask questions based on kind of things that come up in the interview. So, if you get a lot of questions about one thing that maybe, say, it wasn't as emphasized in the job description as you would have expected based on the questions you got, you could ask, how big a component, what percentages of the time are going to be on tasks like this versus tasks like that. Really, the only don't here is asking questions that you should already know the answer to. Basic things that are really widely publicly available. Those are things that you want to take the initiative to answer for yourself through your research. And it's always fair to ask about next steps. What does the process look like from here? When can I expect to hear? Those are all very, very fair questions. So once the interview happens, what do? Oftentimes there's a lot of waiting. So I will warn you about that. But the first thing to do is send a thank you email. Try to send it within 24 hours of the interview. Send a separate message to each person that you spoke to throughout the day, and try to personalize the message. You can keep it short. It can only, just a couple of sentences is all you need. But if you can call back to something particular that the person asked you about, or something that you learned from them in the questions that you asked, those are all really great things to let the person know, you are taking the time to send individualized message to each person. And that's nice. People like to know that you are invested in the process. And then in terms of following up, if you don't hear back within the time frame that you're given at the end of the interview, it's okay to follow up once, but probably not more than that. Try to wait a few more days after that time frame elapses, and then send a short email just kind of reiterating your interest in the position, asking if there are any updates. And finally, just staying patient, because hiring timelines are so unpredictable. Just because there's a little bit longer wait than you expected doesn't mean it's bad news. Oftentimes, things come up with human resources, and things just take a little bit longer than a hiring manager is really hoping for. So stay positive until you hear back. And that's all of my presentation. So I'm going to stop here. I just saw that there's a question in the chat, so let me come back to it. Just someone had to pop out. So I'll open it up for questions. If anyone has questions about anything that I've covered here, or scenarios that you've encountered, or questions that I didn't address, I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, I have one question. I know in the beginning you were mentioning that maybe a direct supervisor would interview you or someone else. If it's not the direct supervisor, do you have suggestions about what type of questions they would ask, or thoughts about that? Would it be the more general ones that you mentioned at the end?
It could be general questions. It could just depend on who the person is, right? So, it might not be the direct supervisor could be in the interview, but maybe there are additional people there who are maybe that person's supervisor, depending on the setup, or maybe somebody who is in a role that would be kind of parallel to yours. That sometimes happens. So like the supervisor and someone who would eventually be your colleague could be in the room. I think, if you know who the folks are before you get into the room, then you can research a little bit about who they are. If you don't know before you get in, usually they'll introduce themselves. And oftentimes people will tell you a little bit about how they might interact with that particular role, just to kind of set the stage for the interview. And so I think you can try to anticipate based on that, whether someone is like how someone might be approaching the questions. But I do think, even if the direct supervisor is not in the room, anticipating questions that have to do with that job description, thinking through, okay, what are these people likely to want to know about me based on what they're looking for? Those are definitely things that you can prepare for. Yeah. Thanks for that question. Any others? Any info or tips for group interviews? This is such a good question. Thank you, Lola. So group interviews can be a little bit of a challenge. I think one, you kind of have to feel out the situation when you get there. Exactly kind of how the setup works might influence the way that you approach it. I would say I would keep your preparation quite similar. So you still want to do research about the organization. You still want to think about kind of where you are in terms of the grand scheme of the organization as a whole in this particular role. But then the extra challenge of the group interview usually is, it's not just a time-saving measure. It's usually because that role probably has some kind of a group work component to it, some kind of an interpersonal component, and they're looking to see how you interact. So I think the kinds of things that we learn in college about kind of how to behave in the classroom setting, taking a step forward, taking a step back, answering things, being vocal, being part of the conversation, but also making the space for other people to ask questions or answer questions, things like that is the key thing here. So knowing, just kind of being aware of the space that you're taking up in that situation is probably the most important thing for group interviews. Any other questions?
Yeah, I had one more about questions you'll get in an interview. If you get a question about, like, can you give an example of like a time that you did this, or an example of the skill that we asked about in the job description, and you don't have an example, do you have advice about that?
So I would say, it depends on exactly what the situation is, but I would say I would try to answer it with something as similar as you can. So maybe if you don't directly have like social media management experience, but you do have experience with communications in another way, maybe try to answer it in that respect. And then I think I would try to kind of anticipate the responsibilities of the position. So I would think about, what you can say as far as what you expect you would encounter in this role. So thinking about like, maybe I don't have direct experience with, like graphic design, but here is, these are the other skills I think that I can bring to bear in getting up to speed with what's needed in this position. Such good questions, y'all. Any others? So remember, like I said, you are more than welcome to make an appointment with a peer career advisor. They're here Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. They can do interview prep, do mock interviews with you. You can also make appointments with our staff advisors as you have interviews come up. And good luck if you're in application processes right now. We're here to support you, and please let us know how it goes, okay? All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon, have a good weekend.